Now, here's the thing. This is very audience participatory, so I would hope that you all would come up with a few questions to talk to our guests about, anything that's on your mind. And I would just like to start with the both of you. We have a million different issues, and I'm sure everybody talked about different issues at their tables. I think what we really talked about was the history of the world, starting with the Soviet Union, coming forward. It's a lot to cover in 15 minutes. But, right? But Melanne, you had just an amazing resume. We were just talking. She was on that Africa trip way back in the 1990s with Bill Clinton as we went from here to there to everywhere. And since then you were nominated and served under President Obama. Now you're over at Georgetown. And so I would just sort of like to get your world view of sort of the subjective and the objective. How is the sort of American experience that we're going through, particularly as it relates to women, being perceived beyond our borders, as opposed to how perhaps we're perceiving it here in the United States?
Well, first of all,
I know that's a lot.
I really want to thank the Presidential Precinct for what you are doing, and especially the co-chairs for bringing us together tonight. I was in the Obama administration when the Young African Leaders Program was created, and I would say that it was important then. It is probably that much more important today because we are desperate for principled leadership in our world, and I think that's not confined to our country. It's really widespread, the need. And you extraordinary fellows represent that. We were having a scintillating discussion at our table on leadership and various aspects and what accounts for the state that we're in and what would improve it. And I was thinking, because we have 3 fellows, all women at our table, 3 lawyers of the 3, they're all lawyers, but they're human rights lawyers. They're involved in dealing with gender-based violence. They're involved in bettering the lot of women. And so, you know, for me, the importance of the discussion is that we have to really recognize that our world has to unleash the talents, the potential, the possibilities that half the world's population represents. We aren't where we need to be in this country, but we certainly have a long way to go in other countries. And I think we understand today more and more, not enough, but more and more that we're not going to solve our global issues. We're not going to be able to address climate change or good governance, what this program is all about, nor peace and security issues or issues having to do with economic prosperity. We need to tap the talents of all of our people. And I have seen all over Africa how that is happening. And it is going to be these extraordinary Mandela Fellows and others like them who are part of this large cohort of leaders who will continue to make the difference. Now, when people look at our country, many whom I encounter, and I travel a great deal around the world, they're aghast at some of what is happening because you know, we are that bastion of democracy, or that's how we've always seen ourselves. I've been involved in countless programs with Americans who are doing democracy, you know, teaching it, bringing trainings, talking about what matters. And yet one feels slightly hypocritical today because the folks at the other end of that process are saying, yeah, but look at all the problems you folks have. And then we revert to, but this is what we all need to be doing. We in our circumstances, you in your circumstances. Something like the Me Too movement has empowered women all over the world. What they saw here has been replicated in so many places because it's been seen as long overdue. Violence against women is a global scourge, and addressing it here in the prominent ways it's been addressed has been inspirational. So you've got the good and the bad and the in-between.
So Senator Warner, now this of course is your host senator for your visits to Monticello and Virginia Tech and other places. Thank you for being here. Senator Warner also happens to have been the governor of Virginia for a period, and he's got three daughters, right?
Three daughters.
Three daughters. Beautiful wife. So he's quite busy, and not to mention the Intelligence Committee. So, Senator, I want to pick up on that, but and you all feel free to chime in and stand up and put your hand up and ask a question too. Senator, the thing that, well, I should say, one of the many takeaways when you look at the American experience right now, as it relates to women, as it relates to almost anybody, is also the fact that the United States is not alone in these changes and these shifts toward nationalism, for lack of a better word. How do you see it? What has happened to us to have a Brexit, to have these political upheavals in Western countries? And how did we get there?
That's an easy question.
He's big on easy questions.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for doing this. Ambassador, it's great to see you again. I want to also thank my dear friends Jim and Bruce Murray, who are sponsors, and also who, for those of my friends who are the Mandela Fellows, I'm actually one of the few politicians that give money instead of simply take money. And I'm proud to support this initiative. And I'm going to come to your question, Joe, on this, but I also want to start with the conversation. I credit Jim with making us not talk about current politics, which are kind of dreadful in a whole lot of ways. But our conversation, a young man was talking about the kind of how our Constitution started. The lady was talking about the notion of rule of law and the fact that and when the gentleman said, the firemen still show up 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, this kind of notions that we sometimes accept in this country. And to the fellows, one, thank you for coming. Thank you for helping to educate us about your countries and about Africa, where most of the world's growth and economic development, the lines on growth in Africa surpass everything else in the rest of the world over the last 10 years. But it's and Joe mentioned the fact that I was governor of Virginia, so let me just, we all live in complicated histories. In one way, Virginia was the birthplace, and you've seen, of Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, all who had incredible ideas about creating a document that endowed certain basic human rights. But they also created that system in the Commonwealth of Virginia at a time when the Constitution, our Declaration, which we still celebrate 260 years later, was a country where still the only power with white men who had property. People of color, women. We even wrote into a constitution that said that the native people in our country would only get to be counted at 3/5 of a person in terms of voting. And if I just think for a moment about Virginia, I say this as a Virginian who was not born here but adopted and as a Virginian. We went from the founders of our country great ideas to 100 years later, where in Virginia, rather than allowing some level of equality, Virginia decided to break away and succeed, and Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. 50 years after that, in talking about women, and I say this as in a household where with a wife and 3 daughters, I better be in favor of women's empowerment or I'm in trouble. And frankly, the fact that we don't have, the fact that we don't have equality of women's empowerment costs the world economy $12 trillion a year. But in a place like Richmond that was still fairly biased, prejudiced, and backwards, an African-American woman named Maggie Walker built the first women-owned bank, the first African-American-owned bank in the whole United States, and it started as a penny savings bank, and we still celebrate her history. So that was a step forward, but it's always a step forward and back. 50 years after that, in Virginia, after a Supreme Court decision that said every kid in America ought to be able to go to school in equal settings, and in parts of Virginia, as Lee Middleditch knows, who's a great, great Virginian and a great friend, there were literally parts of Virginia that said they would rather shut down their public schools than have black girls and boys and white girls and boys go to school together. So this movement forward, then backwards, then forward. And then my first kind of real foray into politics was now, gosh, I'm old, 30 years ago, when I became the campaign manager for a guy named Doug Wilder, who became the first African-American governor in the United States ever elected in his own right. So our history, I think the history is probably of all of your countries, there's no straight line towards progress. There's no straight line towards full empowerment. There's no straight line towards equality, no matter what our race or backgrounds are. But what we have been able to do in some way in Virginia and the United States is that path towards progress, as Dr. King has said, that arc towards progress has always been moving. We're at a moment, I would argue, in our country and to a degree in our world. I am going to get back to your question. Even as a politician, I'll get back to your question. But some of that notion of that arc towards progress, whether it be what's happening in America, what's happening in Hungary with Viktor Orbán, what's happening in Russia with Putin, what's happening in Turkey with Erdogan, what's happening in China, the world's most populous country, with President Xi reasserting the power of the Communist Party in China and using all the technology tools to create a surveillance system that those of you who remember the famous book by George Orwell, a surveillance system that would make George Orwell blush. So I think we've got a lot of questions to answer. And my hope is, as somebody who now has gone from being the new guy to being the old guy, I'm ready for you Mandela Fellows to take the mantle and continue.
Questions? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir.
There you go. Oh, I'm sorry. Grab the mic. I forgot to mention.
Thank you for the opportunity. Now, I am Maotonji from Benin. Being a good husband, a good daddy, and a good leader is incredible. I would like to ask a question. Thinking of one adaptive challenge that you have had in your work, can you share with us how you have been able to address that? Because sometimes you, as a leader, a senator, you love to apply certain things, and so that there will be a change in your area of expertise, but it doesn't always work the way that we wish it to be. Can you give us like an example of one challenge you have had and how you have been able to address that successfully? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. in many ways, I I've lived an experience that is almost like a story. I came from a family that didn't have any money. I was public schools in my life. I was the first person to graduate from university in my family. I came out with student debt. I went to law school, but unlike all you lawyers, I never practiced law. And I decided I did politics for a while, and then I decided I would go into business. And I took my whole life savings, $5,000, and invested in a little energy business. I went to work for that business. In 6 weeks, I helped that business go totally bankrupt. Then I started a second business in real estate. And in 6 months, I failed at that again. So by 27, I was broke. I was living out of my car, sleeping on my friends' couches. But I got a third chance in cell phones. And all my friends, I went to Harvard Law School, so all my friends thought, oh, you can get any job you want. And all my friends said, go get a real job. Who's going to want a cell phone? They're still practicing law. But I also realized that if I had not been a white man with the appropriate education, I might not have got a third chance, a second chance, or a first chance. So I think what has tried to make me want to do politics, I always had my parents were not political, but I always thought, the idea of America is a constitution, but the idea of America is that everybody ought to get a fair shot. And working in politics sometimes, the one thing I've had, because my businesses did very well before I went to politics, it's given me independence. And I worry at times, sometimes, that people, we should not have systems where only the people who are successful can be involved in politics. But sometimes in a country like the United States, because of the enormous pressures to raise money, do this and that, we've not figured it out.
So we call that the sort of forest for the trees problem. How do you keep your passion in it and keep your eye on the prize of whatever it is you're trying to achieve when you have all of these external forces?
And I think that's really the precise word, passion. And I'm at a university now, and people here are associated with universities, and many of you are young African leaders. So you are mounting a trajectory. You don't know where it goes. Life is filled with zigzags. But I think what stays steady is, what do you really care about? What are you passionate about? What do you want to make a difference on? And yes, you will be buffeted by all kinds of things that may not work out. But if you can keep your eye on a prize, I think that's what matters. I was privileged to know President Mandela. And I have to say, there is somebody, at my table is a fellow from South Africa. And what he did in terms of trying to move from apartheid to what really needed to happen for the African people in his country. And he suffered horribly. What was it, 27 years in prison. The quarry where he chipped the gravel basically blinded him. And yet he had no anger in him. He had a goal. He knew what he wanted to achieve. He had a passion. But we can learn from him because he kept his eye on the prize. And when he was inaugurated, and I will never forget this, he had his jailers there at the inauguration. And you ask yourself, given what happened to him, how could that be? Why did he do that? And he said, I could not live with myself if I could not forgive. Because I won't get to what I want to do. I'm president. I need to go on. And that passion stayed with him, even in his advanced years. He started something called the Elders, where he took people like himself and he inspired them, former presidents and other leaders, to say, we have an obligation. There are so many challenges that need to be addressed. And what are we going to do about it collectively? So I think, in a way, the question is answered by the fellow, the man to whom this fellowship is dedicated. In many ways, we have so much to learn from him because fundamentally he cared, he believed in equal rights, and he had a passion for justice.
And let me just add one thing to that, because I think, obviously President Mandela, Nelson Mandela, some of you all would, a world figure of enormous renown, but he had that passion, he had that sense of forgiveness. But I think sometimes with social media, we view people and we think everyone's line is straight up.
It's not.
Right.
Through no person of success, there's always failure along the way. And I think we sometimes expect our young people today to always be successful at everything.
Well,
I've failed at everything I've ever tried to do in politics, in business, not so far in family, but in politics and business and everything else. And if you're not willing to fail and learn from that, I think that is one of the things that has been uniquely American. If there was ever an export that America could give to the rest of the world, it's that sense that you get a second or third chance. And we need to make sure everybody gets that chance.
But if I could just add to that, because I've been to countries where a sense of failure can inhibit you from doing what you genuinely want to do. Entrepreneurs, in some ways, are held back and can't create that wind at the back of their economy because you are stigmatized if you fail. And there's a lot of failure in starting businesses. So I think that's a really important point.
Right there at my table, we can, okay, there you go. Okay, perfect.
Good evening, everyone.
What's your name? What's your name?
I am Alhaji Abu Kome. I'm from Freetown, Sierra Leone. I work in the Parliamentary Office in
Sierra Leone
Legislature, and I'm a Mandela Washington Fellows from Virginia Tech. Thank you.
They have that spirit already.
I know.
College allegiance.
Hokies.
I am economist. I am an economist. I am interested in money. I am interested on how taxes are collected. I am interested in how public finances are spent. And I am interested in how these are accounted for and how they are audited. And I also want to know how these public finances reflect in development and people's welfare.
Good
So
for
I
you.
have a question for the senator. At Virginia Tech, we've had the opportunity of visiting the Office of Management and Budget. Just this morning, before coming here, we visited the GAO, and we visited the Capitol. We've gone to Congress. So, based on what we've learned, I have this question for you as a senator. The budget process in the US is quite complex. There are so many parties that are involved in it. So I want to create a scenario for you. How does it look like when the president has his own national priorities and you as a senator would have your own priorities at state level and also at city level, but then you also have to deal with Congress that is responsible for passing the bill on the budget. Let's say the president has this priority, and you have a case to present for your people, say in Virginia. But then the president says, this is really not a priority for me, and you know that you are accountable to your citizens, and you want to make sure that you do provide for them. And you also have Congress, who has the authority to now pass the bill on the budget. How does the process of lobbying for resources in the budget process happen to you? What has been your experience? So really, that's my first question. And the second one will be, I'm very interested in numbers. I know that the current debt level of the United States is about 22 trillion US. And the budget is around $4 trillion. How does States of America affect the issues that you push for during budget appropriation? Thank you.
Well, first of all, you have asked my favorite question, and you need to make sure you give my staff person your card, because I need to give you a long answer. The short answer is this. The United States has benefited in most of the 20th century and the 21st century for two reasons. One reason, that for most of its time, particularly post-World War II, it ran a relatively small deficit, and because, particularly even post-World War I, the United States ended up with the most gold in the world, we were the reserve currency. So we also had the reserve currency, which gave you extra ability, and the fact was we would normally raise pretty much as much money as we spent. But over the last 50 years, politicians of both parties have said the way to get elected is to say, I'm going to cut your taxes, but I'm going to increase spending. And for years and years, that budget number has crept up. At the beginning of Obama, we were about 14 trillion. And now we're up to 22. We're actually going to go to 24 trillion within the year. And this is an enormous debt we are leaving to the young people of America. It is irresponsible beyond belief. So there are just three quick points I want to make, but we can find a time to give you the whole story. One, and this is not popular, and even though I know that the video is on, America does not raise enough revenues. Of the 34 OECD nations, first world nations in the world, Americans always say, oh, we have way too high taxes. America is 31st out of 34. We are the lowest taxed international major power in the world, number one, about 19% of our GDP. Number two, the part of our budget that is called the discretionary budget, you know, money that goes, which we should protect for Medicare, for Social Security, for Medicaid, programs for people who need help, is the fastest growing part of the budget. Part of that is because politicians in our healthcare system is way too expensive. Part of that is just because politicians don't do math very well. When I was a young man, there were 16 people working for every one person on retirement. Today, there are 3 people working for every one person on retirement. It's not because the politicians screwed up, it's the doctor's fault because we're living longer. But it is true. That's a blessing that we're living longer, but we didn't adjust how much you pay in or how long you have to wait to receive your benefits. 2 last things. Third thing is, the United States of America has a defense budget bigger than the next 10 countries in the world. We are spending $750 billion a year on defense. Russia spends $70 billion, yet Russia attacks our democracy through cybersecurity, through misinformation, disinformation, and frankly, our defense budget is way too focused on 20th century military as opposed to where conflict will happen in the 21st century, cyber, misinformation, disinformation, and space. And last point is, and this is where at the end of the day, if the United States doesn't fix its finances, it will not be, continue to be the great power I hope it will continue to be, is the only part of our government spending that we're cutting, and you're a budget geek like me, is what is in America called discretionary domestic spending. What that means in English is it means we're cutting infrastructure, it means we're cutting education, it means we're cutting research and development. So now, an American who pays $1 to Washington in taxes, and politicians also pay to their state and locality, but just for the national government. For every dollar we send to Washington in taxes, only 6 cents goes to education, roads and infrastructure, and research and development. I was a business guy longer than I've been a politician. I don't care what political party you belong to, that is a bad business plan. And for a long time, the United States would get it right. And one of the challenges I think that African countries have is because sometimes African countries have been willing to try to inflate their way out and print more money, rather than have any budget controls, or not have appropriate controls around graft, or not make the investments in education, infrastructure, and research, then your country is not able to compete on a world stage. And that was always America's advantage, but if we lose that advantage because we are not being fiscally responsible, we're not going to be well. Back to this young man here who wanted to be a politician. Any politician that always promises you, I'm going to cut your taxes and spend more on your favorite program, don't vote for them.
Can I just say very quickly that while the question had to do with the American budgetary system, there's a lesson that all of you can learn from this, all of you leaders, which is it takes leadership to make hard decisions about how spending should be done, how you make the decisions for reductions. I worked in a White House under President Clinton. One of the things he worked very hard to do was bring the budget under control. I can tell you as I sit here, there were members of Congress who lost their elections over that vote. Because for some, it meant being hit hard at home from people who didn't exactly understand why that made a difference. The reality is, what it led to was a great economic expansion, but it was a very tough medicine that had to be swallowed. So this is a lesson for leadership, and I think that's one thing you have to take from it. The other thing is, you all know there's a lot of corruption that goes on in government. There's a lot of destruction of the public treasure that goes in other people's pockets. And I remember talking to President Sirleaf when she became president of Liberia. And she said, I could have brought all of these people into power who were expected to have these positions, but I went with younger people who were technically proficient, who I knew wouldn't be corrupt, but would help us achieve the kind of debt reduction we had to achieve to begin to be taken seriously in the global economic world. So I think, yes, we have a lesson, a strong lesson about our process that doesn't always work well, and right now we're paralyzed. That's the truth of it. We're in political paralysis in the United States. But for all of you to learn from this in terms of what it means for you and your circumstances in your countries.
And with that, as I say, we're going to have to leave it there, I think, unless I've been given the rap sign. Ambassador, Senators, thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us. And we're going to move this program right on along.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.